remains insufficient.
Senator Paul.
Secretary Blinken, on your recent trip to China, news reports came back and said that you reserved your strongest language for China and its dealings with Russia, castigating Beijing for allowing the war to continue in Ukraine. The report went on to describe the exchange as such a blatant dressing down in the Chinese capital. Do you think publicly scolding China will make it more or less likely that they continue selling dual-use parts to Russia?
Senator, we've tried it both ways. We've had these conversations with China from some time in private, hoping to see a change. We haven't seen that, and it's important.
I would argue that we've only tried it one way. We've got the stick, and almost the majority of people who work for you, everybody wants to use the stick. Nobody's really considering that there is a carrot. So really, for the last, let's say, 5 years or more, your administration, the previous administration, not a lot different, really, that you put impediments to trade, you add sanctions, and then you scold them. And I mean, there is a school of philosophy or school of diplomacy that believes that public scolding, particularly in another country, can have the opposite effects, that actually you've either completely given up on this, nothing's working, so why don't we just read them the riot act? And that's kind of what it looked like. Yellen was also there recently, and she's described and told the Chinese government how it should run its economy, what sectors of its economy that they should or should not subsidize, and told them as well who they can conduct business with. And then she threatened to impose sanctions, more or less likely to actually get them to do. I mean, I think it's a misunderstanding of diplomacy in general to think that you going and scolding the Chinese, Yellen going and scolding the Chinese, that somehow they're going to go, oh my goodness, we've been wrong all along, and because they've yelled at us and treated us like school children, we're now going to change. I would think that the opposite might be true, that there might be a certain amount of child psychology to criticizing people, and that like a rebellious teenager, they actually might end up doing more. In addition to the threat of sanctions, in addition to the scolding, we now have the administration talking about more tariffs. So in June of 2019, then presidential candidate Joe Biden tweeted, "Trump doesn't get the basics. He thinks his tariffs are being paid for by China. Any freshman econ student would tell you that the American people are paying his tariffs." Remarkably accurate and true at that time, but now he's become jumping on the Trump train. But the thing about tariffs, regardless of who pays them, American consumers will pay for these. Tariffs are not good for the economic well-being of all Americans in general. But the question would become, when you add tariffs, so you're going to threaten sanctions, you're going to scold them, now you're going to add tariffs. More or less likely that they'll do what you want? I think less likely. Everything we're doing, everything the previous administration did, as well as this administration, is heading towards less tradement, disengagement from China. Part of diplomacy might be offering, well, I tell you what if you quit selling the dual-use parts to Russia? Maybe we could consider removing some sanctions on trade and actually trade more with you. So the threat of sanctions, the threat of tariffs, actually have some effects if you're willing to remove them. The history of sanctions is more, and then you're not doing enough, and people on the right here will say you got to do even more, we're going to pass legislative sanctions. Nobody talks about removing them, but that's the only way you'd get behavior to change. And so I really think that it's a fundamental misunderstanding sort of what's going on. The final point I would like to make, and I'll let you respond to this, is the Ukrainians still claim that victory includes the reclamation of all of its territory. Many NATO allies are beginning to question this. Czech President Petr Pavel, who once served as the chairman of NATO's military committee, recently stated that he believes it's naive to think that Ukraine will be able to regain the occupied territories from Russia. The commander-in-general of the Ukrainian army, until he was fired by Zelensky, had the same sort of comments. I think that it's not an unreasonable thing to believe that this war may well end in stalemate with people in place. Some say similar to the way Korea was. Nobody likes it, nobody wanted it, nobody agrees the Russians should be there, but they're there and they have a bigger army and more might than their neighbor. So if President Pavel is correct in his assessment that Ukraine's war aims are naive, one of the few negotiating items Ukraine possesses is a promise to remain a neutral country, not aligned militarily, yet you have repeatedly ruled out Ukraine remaining outside of NATO. If you take this off the table, you're taking off one of the things that actually is a negotiating item. My question to you is, are there any circumstances under which neutrality of Ukraine would be a negotiating item?
Thank you, Senator. Let me try to respond to both questions. First, if you want to look at hectoring or haranguing, I would invite you to look at the website of the Chinese Foreign Ministry on a daily basis in terms of what they say about us. Second, I'm not going to apologize to anyone for standing up for American workers and American companies, because here's what we're dealing with. And by the way, of course, you're right, we always try. And as a diplomat, I always try to engage our partners or adversaries diplomatically, quietly, to see if we can get the result. If we don't, then we have to use every means at our disposal, including calling them out. Let me, if I may, please address the question. So on this, what we've seen and what we're seeing now, and this goes to the tariff question, is China very deliberately using overcapacity in critical sectors to export its way out of its current economic troubles, and to do that in a way that undercuts and indeed could gut our own workers and industries. All of that is true,
but my question to you is there an offer ever that you would undo things in exchange for behavior?
Of course, and that goes...
So you want to argue tariffs are good and sanctions are good. Yeah. The offer would have to be to say to the government, quietly or otherwise, that we would be willing to go in the opposite direction.
Of course.
There's no public, I hear no public discussion, not from Congress and not from anyone in the administration.
Senator,
we would undo this if this.
Senator, so, on their own terms, it's clear that if the conduct that we object to and that risks terrible damage to our workers, to our communities, to our companies, if they change that conduct, of course.
Did you specifically discuss not having tariffs or undoing sanctions in exchange for the Chinese to quit selling dual-use parts to Russia? In the context, sure, if their companies don't engage in that practice, we're not going to sanction them. I didn't hear any public statements of that. Did you make private statements to President Xi that you would undo trade sanctions and not put on tariffs in exchange for better behavior towards Russia?
By definition, if they don't engage in the conduct that we object to, then we're not going to be using those tariffs or using those sanctions.
But this sounds like me drawing this out of you. It doesn't sound to me like this is the kind of diplomacy that's occurring. If you want it to occur, you have to have a little different conception of you've got the stick. The whole problem with diplomacy in this country, not just your administration, but the previous, is all you see is the stick, all you see is more sanctions. And if I ask you to tell me what has China done to change its behavior based on your sanctions, to change their behavior for the better, I would say you can't come up with anything China's doing. Everything seems to be the wrong direction. That's your interpretation. Everything's the wrong direction.
No, we've actually
so the sanctions really are not having a value unless you want to negotiate removing sanctions to get better behavior.
Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr.